Okay, I think we are ready to go. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. We are here again for another webinar of our series on screens. This afternoon, it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker, who is Richard Grusin. Many of you, I'm sure, know him because of his great contributions in the field of media studies. Richard Grusin is Professor of English and Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. He earned his BA in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Then he earned his PhD in English from the University of California at Berkeley. Then he taught at Georgia Institute of Technology, where he was chair of the School of Literature, Communication, and Culture. He was professor of English at Wayne State University, where he served as English department chair, and in 2007 served as visiting professor in media studies at the University of Amsterdam. Everybody knows Richard Grusin, first of all, for his 1999 book, Remediation, which really established a field, Understanding New Media, that he co-authored with J. David Bolter. The founding text of the field of new media studies, actually. One of his latest book, Premediation, Affect and Mediality After 9/11, develops and extends the theory of premediation. In that book, Richard argues that at least since the new millennium, networked global media seek to ensure that the future is already premediated before it emerges into present. And I'm sure, I'm confident that we will hear a lot more on this concept of premediation in today's talk. So please, Richard, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Vittorio, for putting this series together. It's been really instructive, and it's not the same as being in person, but it's been good nonetheless. Okay, so I'm going to read this talk. I've been also grateful for the invitation because early in the pandemic, I was thinking I wanted to write something about pandemic mediation and started taking notes and so forth. And then everybody was writing about the pandemic. It was just a huge like tsunami of pandemic work, and it was too much to keep up with. And I just figured I would wait and see what happened. Well, now a year later, we just passed the 1-year anniversary of the WHO declaring the pandemic. And I think now maybe it's time to begin to do some more reflection. So this is a preliminary piece in that it's really my first attempt to put these thoughts together, but I do employ some of the theoretical concepts I've been using and writing about historically. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and let's begin. Hold on. Is that working for everybody or no? Are we good?
Not yet.
Not yet. So I have, hold on. Let me do this.
You should press on the symbol of the arrow inside a square, and then you should be able to choose desktop and then show the presentation, which is on.
I did that. Share screen, choose desktop.
Okay. Yeah, here we are.
Okay, great. But now I need to do that. Okay, perfect. Okay, So the word pandemic in my title refers specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic, the infectious disease that has, to refer to the word's etymology, pan plus demos, that is spread potentially to all the people. But for me, the people are not meant to be understood only as humans, but to refer as well to non-human people, socio-technical actants, and especially for the purpose of this talk, mediation. In talking about pandemic mediation, I want to be precise in referring to it as a COVID-19 pandemic, not as US cable news media outlets like CNN or NBC have continued to do, a coronavirus pandemic. So you see here, both CNN and MSNBC capture this as a coronavirus pandemic. The coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 is not the same as the disease COVID-19. These need to be distinguished when talking about different forms of pandemic mediation. Coronaviruses have been around for centuries. SARS-CoV-2 is a novel coronavirus, one of 7 that have been identified as infecting humans. COVID-19 is the disease that's caused by SARS-CoV-2. The pandemic properly refers to the disease, COVID-19, not to the coronavirus that causes it. So we need then to understand the COVID-19 pandemic, not just as a global health event, but as a global media event, or more accurately, a global mediation event. In tracing then different concepts of mediation regarding the pandemic today, I want to distinguish between thinking it as a global health event and thinking it as a global mediation event. For me, thinking pandemic mediation helps to keep in relation the greatest number of human and non-human elements. The virus SARS-CoV-2, the particular viral outbreak, COVID-19, zoonotic transmission across human and non-human bodies, transportation, communication, and commercial networks or infrastructures of global capital, biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies, and so forth. So pandemic for me is a broad term that refers not just to the humans and the virus, but actually to all of these networks that participate in circulating it, etc. In today's talk, as I've been doing in different ways for 25 years, I'll distinguish between mediation and representation. That is, between mediation as a form of communication that comes into the picture to provide a representation after the event of the pandemic has emerged, and that's the notion of mediation as representation. And then between what I call radical mediation, in which mediation is a place to begin thinking. Starting with mediation is to start in the middle of things rather than at the beginning or the end. Because despite the various origin stories circulating about COVID-19, it's best understood as a disease that emerges in the middle of a world in which coronaviruses are always already present, or at least have been always already present, at least through much of the 20th century. But as my subtitle, Screening COVID-19, suggests, I want also to think about how this particular pandemic has been mediated or remediated on our screens across our digital screen space. So after taking up the pandemic as a global mediation event, I'll look at how pandemic mediation functions as a form of remediation in which COVID-19 has been remediated in a variety of print, televisual, and network media formats. I'll turn next to the ways in which the remediation of the ongoing pandemic participates in the logic and practice of premediation, as Vittorio himself premediated in the introduction, to understand how premediating the course of the pandemic has impacted the demos, both in its human and non-human implications, in ways different, but not categorically distinct from how COVID-19 has impacted humans and non-humans alike. I'll conclude by thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic from the perspective of non-human or radical mediation as a way to argue that mediation generates COVID-19 in addition to hypermediating it across our digital screens. So this next section is called COVID-19 pandemic as a global mediation event. Public health experts have described the coronavirus pandemic as a global health event. The zoonotic origin of the novel severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, first reported in Wuhan, China, and the global spread of the coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19, promises to be a defining global health event of the 21st century. This pandemic has already resulted in extreme societal, economic, and political disruption across the world and in the United States. But the pandemic is more than just a global health event. It's also been what Andreas Hepp and Nick Coldry have called a global media event. This concept expands upon the idea of media events defined in the early 1990s by Daniel Dayan and Elihu Katz. Dayan and Katz understood media events like the Olympics or the Academy Awards or political elections as high holidays of mass communication, which function as a form of ritual to create social integration within nation states. Hepp and Coldry argue that global media events need to be understood beyond the nation-based model of Dayan and Katz as functioning translocally across the increasingly hybrid media cultures of the 21st century. This is a valuable corrective. In thinking about COVID-19 pandemic as a global mediation event, however, as opposed to a global media event, I want to emphasize not only its cultural hybridity, but a more radical hybridity that goes beyond cultures to include non-human nature and technologies. The coronavirus itself is transgressive not only of national borders, but also of the borders of human and non-human bodies. As I will discuss later, the virus operates as a form of radical mediation that reproduces itself irrespective of human and non-human borders. To think of COVID-19 as a global mediation event is to recognize that unlike global media events, which follow predetermined temporal schedules, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted periodic media events, replacing them with aperiodic emergency coverage, new daily, weekly, and special shows, news supplements, and news conferences on the progress of the pandemic. Such emergency coverage, however, soon became the norm. As Walter Benjamin's written, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. Initially, most people knew COVID-19 only as an exceptional media event, but this soon became normalized through the periodic formats of print, televisual, and networked news media. Even today, a year after the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and even as most of us now know it through a neighbor, friend, family members, or our own disease or loss of job, housing, or insurance, we continue to know these losses as media events, as instances of media narratives. Of course, this is by no means a new phenomenon. Walter Lippmann argued in the early 20th century, for example, that citizens could only know what was happening across the world through the media, and that we needed to rely on experts to understand them, something that has been true with COVID-19 as well. Less true with the former president of the US, who didn't really care about experts, but most of us understand it through the experts. But to say that the COVID-19 pandemic is a global mediation event is not to say in any sense whatsoever that it is not real, that it's not a virological, public health, social, political, or economic actant or event. In fact, to call it a global mediation event is to say precisely the opposite. As I've been arguing for more than 2 decades, media and mediation have real material consequences. Thus, to characterize the COVID-19 pandemic as a global mediation event is to invite us to think about the ways in which mediation has material and affective consequences for important issues like environmental justice or structural racism and the uneven impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, not only on individual bodies and citizens, but on the health and mood of translocal, global, human and non-human collectives or assemblages. I want in the remainder of this talk then to consider some of the different media logics through which this global mediation event manifests, specifically how it operates through processes of remediation, premediation, and radical mediation. As Jay Bolter and I first argued in 1996, all mediation is remediation. The double logic of COVID-19 remediation entails the immediacy of photographic images and the hypermediacy of graphic visualization. And it's not the kind of dramatic remediation event that, let's say, 9/11 was, but you can see in these images the sort of direct immediacy of the photograph as somebody's getting a nasal swab for testing, and then that hypermediated announcement of free COVID screenings. Most obviously, however, COVID-19 is presented as remediating earlier coronavirus pandemics, like the recent swine flu pandemic or AIDS, HIV, or the Spanish flu of 1918. Not only does a graphic like this one remind us of the xenophobic othering involved in naming past and current pandemics, Spanish flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, and then the derogatory names that had been used by Trump and some others for the current COVID-19. But it also reminds us that all of the coronaviruses that infect humans are zoonotic. That is, they cross over between human and non-human animals. For these coronaviruses, the distinction between humans and non-humans, so fundamental in the history of Western philosophy, does not exist. To remediate COVID-19, public health, science, and media experts have relied on familiar forms of visual or graphic mediation used to remediate prior epidemics. Graphs like these, and I've got the H1N1 examples on the left and the COVID-19 on the right for the next few slides, just to show the remediation is somebody wants remote control of my screen. The remediation of the same visual formats from previous pandemics. So we've got graphs. Hold on a second. Yeah, this is annoying. We've got graphs, we've got graph chart hybrids, which are sort of graphs, but also with chart-like information. We've got maps to show the spread of the disease, cases of the disease, and images of the virus, H1N1 virus, similar but not the same as COVID-19 virus. In each of these cases, H1N1 and COVID-19 are remediated according to familiar graphic formats. Most of these remediations entail what I've called data mediation, in which numerical data is remediated visually through charts, graphs, and maps. I coined the neologism data mediation several years ago to try to think through the wide variety of ways in which data is and has been remediated through digital technologies. And more significantly for me, how data itself functions as a form of mediation. In creating this concept, I aim to think through the logics of data remediation in human and non-human life and non-life in the 21st century. With the term data mediation, I also mean to gesture towards the socio-technical, juridical, effective framework of control within which we presently live. Data is remediated and premediated in almost every area of contemporary life: finance, consumer behavior, education, government, science, health, or sport. Data mediation holds together numerous interrelated mediating practices, diverse not only in the technical materiality of their mediation, but also in their scales and effects. But what most interests me about data mediation is the way in which its hypermediacy becomes phenomenally immediate. That is, data have now become immediate in their mediation. In fact, one might want to argue that in certain situations, data mediation is more immediate than embodied experience in guiding action or behavior, despite the lack of or contradiction by phenomenal experience. So this is an example of this is you go to your doctor, you feel fine, you get a blood test, and your doctor says, oh, your blood sugar is elevated or your cholesterol is elevated, something is wrong with you, you need to start taking medication. You don't have a phenomenal experience of that problem, yet you look at the data and the data forces a course of action so that the data becomes more immediate and more material in a sense than our own embodied experience. So in addition to operating as a form of remediation, data mediation serves to impact individual and collective behavior by means of its graphic premediation of future potentialities. And medical data is almost always about risk, future risk. You want to lower your blood sugar to avoid the risk of complications. You want to lower your cholesterol to avoid the risk of complications, future potentialities. Pandemic data mediation both remediates pre-existing health conditions and premediates future risks. This next section, premediating COVID-19. In light of pandemics like H1N1 or COVID-19, remediation is often a less powerful media practice than premediation. Or more precisely, premediation relies upon remediation in order both to modulate individual and collective mood or affect and to guide action in the present and the future. Where remediation operates to refashion a current or past event in a new form, premediation proliferates potential futures in order to deal not with what's happening now or what's happened in the past, but with what might or will happen in the future. And I would say in order to deal not only with what's happening now or in the past. Pandemic premediations deploy the same data mediation strategies of remediation, but do so not to visualize what's happened, or not only to visualize what's happened, but to speculate or model what might happen. In the early days of the pandemic, premediation was the predominant media logic used to mobilize governments, non-governmental agencies, corporations, and the public to act to prevent financial, political, and public health catastrophes. That is, at the beginning, most of us only knew of COVID through what we saw through print, televisual, and network media. That's changed as COVID has become so much more widespread, of course. Such premediations operated in part by creating a sense of fear in the media public. And here's just one example about how spiraling virus fears are causing financial carnage. But more common was the use of the same graphs, charts, and maps that we looked at in relation to remediation. Some of these graphic premediations presented the future according to a single set of assumptions, as in this UK model, which generates fear of the future by premediating how the pandemic would impact the availability of ICU beds, thus necessitating intermittent population controls. And each of those gray segments are where they would put increased controls in response to a spike in the pandemic. Other premediations presented a variety of divergent models, as this UK model showing how different measures would affect the infection rates. In other words, if we had more social distancing and so forth, we would then we would see this much of an infection, this infection rate, this kind of curve, etc. Other premediations presented, clearly such variations are meant not to serve as predictions, as in this model here, but to create a sense of urgency in the present and to prepare the public to face a variety of increasingly grim scenarios in the absence of social distancing. Indeed, the caption to this graph, you can read it, the bottom says the rate of infection with different measures in place, NB, nota bene, not quantitative predictions, but robust qualitative illustrations. So these are declaredly not about predicting what will happen, but about premediating what will happen. Not their term, but mine. Still other premediations combine maps and graphs, as in these two hybrid premediations. The first, an early Italian pandemic mediation, shows the effects of different scenarios in the first months of the pandemic. So you've got the baseline, and then what February would look like without any March restrictions, and then what the scenario B, what would look like with no restrictions whatsoever. So I mean, restrictions in February, but not March in scenario A. The second set from the US combines remediation with premediation, as well as providing a map with a graph, demarcating the divergence of different models from the individual and cumulative deaths that had already occurred. So you've got a line, you've got a remediation of the number of daily and cumulative deaths, and then there's that line near the right-hand side, and that after that, you see the different premediations of potential models and how they diverge. In trying then to premediate and remediate 21st century pandemics, and here the notion of remediation as environmental reclamation is relevant, the best that can be done is to try to minimize the damage and consequences of an event with its own time frame, which operates according to a temporality and spatiality distinctive from and indifferent to the pace and scale of human time and space. Scientists, politicians, and public health experts can only premediate eventualities and potentialities, changing their premediations on the fly as events and circumstances occur that rule out some possible futures and create, open up, or enable others. Clearly, pandemics, like hurricanes, political elections, or financial crises, lend themselves to a multiplicity of premediations about potential futures. As I argued in my 2010 book on premediation, these ongoing premediations have real effects in the present. COVID-19 is in some sense then a virtual pandemic whose future actualizations are very uncertain. Yet the premediation of the pandemic's future threats or dangers has real social, political, affective consequences in the present. As I argue in that book, virtuality and reality are not separate. Virtuality has real effects, and I follow thinking by Deleuze and Guattari and others about the virtual here. It's the actual that is distinct from the virtual. These immediate consequences of premediation occur irrespective of the extent of the virus's reach. That is, people creates fear, creates different kinds of actions, no matter what the future of the virus might end up being. But to call this premediation a virtual pandemic is not to deny that it's real or that these virtual effects are preemptive. these public health, social, and political responses to premediation of the pandemic's future are designed precisely, as the epidemiologists like to say, to flatten the curve. So the aim of premediating these curves, which are not flat at all, these spikes and so forth, are to change. I mean, they're actually the goal of them, if they succeeded, would be to prove them to be inaccurate mediations, because the goal would be that we don't spike, but we take that seriously and put into effect practices that would reduce them or lower them. But the infection curves themselves are also premediations, which have the effect of generating, as I just suggested, the kinds of preemptive activities we've already witnessed. Indeed, pandemics are perfect examples of premediation events. They cannot directly be stopped by human or technical agency the way one can douse a fire, but rely upon individual and collective socio-technical actions whose impact can only be expressed through premediating different potential futures, can only be modulated through indirection in a sense. Thus, news media, public health and scientific institutions, governments and corporations must focus on riding the wave of the future, anticipating how events might develop and how they might best be responded to, rather than being able directly to control or stop these disastrous events. The suspension of public schools, the cancellation of concerts, parades, and major professional and collegiate sporting events, the cancellation or rescheduling of trade shows, industry conventions, academic and other professional conferences, the transformation by universities of face-to-face instruction to online education, including the closing of dormitories, the conversion of restaurants to takeout or delivery only, the rush that we saw initially on toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and some food items. All of these are some of the ways in which premediations of a COVID pandemic, prior to or independent of the different extents to which it ultimately materialized, have had significant material consequences on US and other societies themselves. I mean, you'll remember that Giorgio Agamben reacted very powerfully and strongly against these kinds of actions in response to premediation, in part because of his suspicion of government control, but also because in the beginning, when the pandemic began, we did not have, most of us did not have firsthand experience of the pandemic or its effects. But these changes were being made based upon the premediations of future development of the pandemic that we saw, the various models and so forth. Pandemics operate according to their own time scale, having to do less with the periodicity of the mediatic system than with viral reproduction and transmission. COVID-19 and other viral pandemics might be minimized, modulated, or redirected, not by acting upon them directly as if they were inert passive matter or non-human physical processes, but rather by the kind of indirect activities I just mentioned. The agency, trajectory, and development of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, all operate according to the pandemic's own laws, its own temporality, its own scale. In discussing the workings of remediation and premediation in the case of COVID-19 and other pandemics, it can sometimes be difficult to avoid creating the sense that mediation is somehow separate from or secondary to the events themselves. I want to reiterate that this is not the case, that mediation is not external to these crises, catastrophes, or disasters, but rather immanent to them. That is, there's no possibility of crisis or catastrophe, at least in the 21st century, without its mediation as such. These conceptual and ontological entities are not prior to or independent of mediation, but are in fact constituted as forms or categories of mediation. This is not to deny the ontological reality or status of viral pandemics, but to insist that such events are themselves acts of mediation, insofar as they, to use Karen Barad's powerful conceptual framework, make agential cuts through the interaction of technical apparatuses which compose the ontological fabric of the world, including the complex assemblage of state, corporate, and informal media. So what I'm trying to say, and what I will say in more detail and hopefully more clarity in this final fairly long section, is that we don't, it's, I think, incorrect to think of the pandemic as separate from mediation, as something that pre-exists it and that is only transmitted to us, or and which we only sort of know or interact with through some mediation, some representation, but rather that the pandemic itself is a form of mediation, a form of radical mediation. And I'm going to try to explain that here by getting a little bit into the science. And I am not a scientist, but I think I've got these details correct. So this final section, which is the longest section of the talk, is called Screening COVID-19. So I began today by insisting that we need to be careful to distinguish between SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the disease caused by this particular coronavirus. In the preceding sections, I've looked at a number of ways in which pandemic mediation has worked to screen COVID-19 in a variety of visual media formats. In this final section, I want to talk about the radical mediation of COVID-19, not only by charts, graphs, maps, or images, but also by the binding of S proteins and ACE2 receptors. In so doing, I hope also to show how understanding this radical mediation can help us see another way in which pandemic mediation might work to screen COVID-19. So viruses, we must remember, are not living cells, but rather packages of nucleic acid and protein that need to attach to a host in order to reproduce themselves. Among scientists who study coronaviruses, it's widely understood, and this is a phrase that appears over and over, that ACE2 mediates SARS-CoV-2 infection. This non-human viral mediation is what creates the disease COVID-19, a respiratory infection produced by the virus entering healthy cells and then reproducing itself according to the instructions encoded in its RNA strings. But even this initial cell entry can be seen as a form of mediation that generates the viral infection. In other words, there are a huge number of SARS-CoV-2 viruses floating around, but the virus only lives as an infection after its mediation by a host cell's S protein. It's wrong to see such mediation as coming after the emergence of the virus and the disease. The radical mediation of S protein and ACE2 enzyme is what allows the virus to reproduce, ultimately leading to the COVID-19 pandemic. As Eben Kirksey explains, this mediation is indifferent to the philosophical or categorical distinction between humans and non-humans. From a viral perspective, the boundaries of different animal species are inconsequential. What matters as coronaviruses infect animals and humans is the shape of a specific receptor on the outer membrane of our cells. A certain coronavirus spike protein locks on to a receptor called ACE2, producing a fusion of the viral and host cell membranes. If there's a good fit between the spike and the receptor, the virus gets inside. This non-human viral mediation is what creates the disease COVID-19, a respiratory infection produced by the virus entering healthy cells and reproducing itself. Or, to put this more technically, a large number of glycosylated S proteins cover the surface of SARS-CoV-2 and bind to the host cell receptor angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2, mediating viral cell entry. Similar to other coronaviruses, the S protein of SARS-CoV-2 mediates receptor recognition, cell attachment, and fusion during viral infection. The S protein binds to ACE2 through the RBD region of the S1 subunit, mediating viral attachment to host cells in the form of a trimer, or maybe trimer. So at this point, some of you are probably thinking that this virological definition of mediation means something very different from the way I've been using mediation in this talk, and the way in which we generally understand mediation in the humanities. Like, it's the same word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And this could in part be true. I think it is in part true, particularly if we think of mediation as it's been understood in the Western tradition, at least since Hegel, and probably as far back as Aristotle. But this virological use of mediation is, I want to argue here, of a piece with the concept of radical mediation that I've been developing really for the last almost decade or half decade, particularly as it pertains to all forms of human and non-human natural and technical mediation. That is, radical mediation argues that, or is a concept that is applicable to human and non-human, natural and technical forms of mediation. To think COVID-19 then in terms of radical mediation is to remember that SARS-CoV-2 is zoonotic. That is, it crosses over from non-human to human bodies. David Quammen makes it clear that for zoonotic diseases, there's no categorical or epidemiological distinction between human and non-human hosts. In transgressing the boundaries between humans and non-humans, COVID-19 acts as a form of viral mediation that spills over from organic to inorganic form, from its virological contagion through aerosol droplets to its mediological contagion through the circulation of print, televisual, and socially networked media. There can be no firm ontological boundaries drawn between the COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic mediation in regard to quarantines and other political and social acts of the state. As the extensive premediation of the pandemic continues to remind us, quarantines and social distancing are not only a result of people being infected by the disease itself, but also a result of the viral affectivity of fear that's arguably more contagious than the disease itself. Put differently, the radical mediation of COVID-19 extends the scope of the pandemic to include its mediation by news, politicians, or the public at large. That is, all of these, from my point of view, are part of the pandemic. They're mediation. They are not something separate that follows from a pre-existing pandemic. This is not to say then that the effects of quarantine and other pandemic mediations on human bodies are as severe as the effects of being infected by COVID-19, or, as a large number of politicians and citizens think, that quarantines are bad government policy. And I know in the US, plenty of politicians do. I imagine in Italy, you also have the suspicion of this kind of quarantines, this kind of government action. It is, though, to say that the ontological spillover of COVID-19 mediation flattens the distinctions between disease and mediation in much the same way that the virus refuses to distinguish between human and non-human bodily hosts. But there is a sense in which it would not be entirely wrong to say that the mediations of COVID-19 that I've been discussing are more socially and politically contagious than the virus itself. More people have been infected by the mediated fear of the disease than by the disease itself. In talking about COVID-19 as radical mediation, however, I want to make a different but not unrelated point about pandemic mediation, that there is no categorical distinction between the viral disease and its mediation, as I've been saying. We cannot treat COVID-19 mediation as a form of representation ontologically distinct and secondary to the virus, but as an interaction of radical mediation that generates and reproduces the reality of the pandemic in much the same way as the virus itself does. Thus, it's not simply, I would argue, a metaphor to say that in the long 2020, print, televisual, and network media caught COVID and transmitted it to the public. Unlike the popular metaphor of computer viruses, to think the COVID-19 pandemic through radical mediation is not to think in terms of metaphor, but metonymy. The radical mediation of SARS-CoV-2 is not like metaphor separate from, but analogous to COVID-19, but rather like metonymy is contiguous with it. So what I want to suggest is that the acts of mediation we've been looking at have impacts on the individual and collective bodies that are of a piece, although not identical with, the impact of the virus itself. That these are not separate kinds of actants or events, but actually are interrelated, are contiguous with one another. This metonymic contiguity between mediological infection, oh, sorry, I forgot to put up this picture, better to look at, of how this mediation happens, the stages there. This metonymic contiguity between mediological infection and virological infection in one's body or immune system is precisely how scientific accounts employ the concept of mediation to describe the operation of SARS-CoV-2 in creating the COVID-19 infection. And if you look at this chart, you can see that this is an operation of contiguity, that the mediation of the COVID-2 virus by the S protein is this mediation of contiguity. You get the native state, it connects and binds to the receptor, it reaches a stage of intermediacy where it's not quite fully fused, and then ends with this cell fusion. So let me start this paragraph again. This metonymic contiguity between mediological infection and virological infection in one's body or immune system is precisely how scientific accounts employ the concept of mediation to describe the operation of SARS-CoV-2 in creating COVID-19. Although mediation might appear to be used similarly here to its conventional denotation in Western thought, this viral mediation does not strictly stand between the coronavirus aerosol droplets and its human or non-human host, or between the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID-19 disease, because the COVID-19 disease doesn't even exist until after it is mediated, not prior to its mediation. Because the virus is parasitic on its host to survive, the mediation of SARS-CoV-2's entry into the host cell by its surface protein not only constitutes the contagiousness of COVID-19, but its operation in binding to a host is what guarantees its continued existence. In SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 disease, it is mediation that generates its infectiousness from the binding together of proteins, genes, and a suitable host. Without the radical mediation of these specific glycolylated S proteins, which conjoin the virus to the ACE2 receptors in its human or non-human host, COVID-19 would not exist. Nor would pandemic mediation. which remediates and premediates the COVID-19 pandemic through print, televisual, and network media. Because they do not require contact with specific aerosol droplets, but only with packets of mediation, pandemic mediations are even more easily transmitted than the virus itself. But such mediations can also work to screen COVID-19 from our bodies and to stem the spread of the disease by promoting the changes in individual and collective human behavior that we've all been participating in for the past year. We no longer hold events like this in person. People no longer shake hands or hug one another when they meet, and fundamental public institutions like schools, museums, and libraries have been shut down or radically curtailed. And here, in saying that these mediations screen COVID-19 from our bodies, I'm using a second definition of screen, not the definition of displaying something on a screen as we looked at with remediation and premediation, but the notion of screen as filtering. Okay, to screen something is also to filter something out, to protect and separate one thing from another. And these mediations work in both ways. They're both kinds of, they screen them on our, display them on our screens, screen them in that way, but also through premediation and the effects of premediation, they cause changes in our behavior individually and collectively, and our technical behaviors as well, and institutional behaviors. And those mediations serve to screen out, help to screen out the virus. But in pointing to these changes in our everyday living, we can also note that pandemic mediations worked to encourage the development of immunity to the disease. Arguably, the most powerful effect of pandemic mediation has been its impact on the development, production, and distribution of vaccines, whose effectiveness depends upon people being willing and able to take them. Attaining widespread immunity through vaccination produces a serious challenge in the US and perhaps elsewhere among people of color with deep historically based suspicions of the medical and pharmaceutical industries. And in the EU recently, there's an obstacle to the, the AstraZeneca virus that had for a moment been paused because of some exaggerated suspicions about its danger. Herd immunity through vaccination in the US especially is also hampered by many right-wing Trump supporters who get their news from Fox News and right-wing social media networks, which encourage them to doubt the reality of the pandemic itself and fear the vaccines. The epidemiological effectiveness of the vaccine is inseparable from its mediation. Vaccines will not be able to produce herd immunity if people refuse to take them because they see the pandemic as fake news. So the biological and the mediological are interrelated here as well. Thus, to think the COVID-19 pandemic through radical mediation is to think the multiple mediations of, to name just a few, state quarantines, viral surface proteins, hospital preparedness protocols, and the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. And to think radical mediation in terms of COVID-19 is to remember that in the era of the coronavirus, mediation can no longer be confined to the realm of media and communication, but must be theorized as fundamental to the generation and reproduction of what William James calls our pluralistic universe, of which, like COVID-19 itself, we find ourselves inescapably and unavoidably in the middle. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard, for this very, very rich and intriguing approach through to the pandemic through the lens of mediation, premediation, and remediation. Just to give a little time to our friends to think about what I want to learn more from you. I've used the privilege of being the chair of this webinar to ask you a first question. What we witnessed during the last year has been a sort of diachronic repetition of the same script, namely the poor effectiveness of premediation. We learned about what was going on in Wuhan. It looked very distant. People made jokes about China, about people flying to China. There were jokes about bats and all sorts of things. Then Italy was very heavily hit. But simultaneously, the neighboring countries were not taking advantage of this second premediation. And basically, each country, with a time interval of a few weeks, followed the same path. Negligence, repression, finally being hit, coming to terms with reality, taking measures. So now probably after 1 year has passed, we feel more through premediation, we feel more part of a global event than we were at the beginning. How do you see why premediation was so poorly effective?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it was, I guess I don't agree that it was so ineffective. I think that it was both, it had its effectivities and it had its ineffectivities. So the effectivity it had was at the beginning, institutions were shutting down, imposing quarantine based not on the experience that people had had, not on a large number of infections. In fact, when you look at the number of infections in the beginning, it's almost as if we could get back there, if we could have the level of infection now we had when it began, that might be something we could live with. But it wasn't then because of what was happening at the moment. It was because of this really kind of barrage of premediations on cable news, in the newspapers, in social media, and the various models that some of the ones I looked at, right, that showed us, look, if we don't do anything, it's going to go like this. And if we do something, it's only going to, And so I think there was a lot of effectivity at the beginning. But because that effectivity came through our print and televisual and networked media, and because today in the US, and I take it other places as well, you have two media universes, then the negative, the claims of fake news or the claims that this isn't real and so forth, that began to, I think, impact on the effectiveness. So I think that premediation was simultaneously very effective at the beginning in getting us to do things, not to stop the disease because that was so, difficult and because it took so long to put things into motion, especially a vaccine, and because people were skeptical or suspicious. Not everybody believes the media. Some people fear in this country the media itself more than they fear some of the things that are being presented on the media.
So my impression was that premediation works much better when it is somehow related to some sort of proximity of the premediation process, which means it doesn't necessarily have to affect your neighbors or member of your families, but at the very least, until you don't listen to the noise of the sirens in the silent streets at night that grows exponentially in parallel with the spreading of the disease, of the infection, the impact of premediation is less powerful. So you may call that a local mediation that
Right.
gives increased strength to the premediation. It has to be closer to you in order. In some cases, it doesn't affect people's opinion. Even on their deathbed, there were people still refusing to accept the idea that COVID-19 was a real dangerous entity.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, people like in the US, so politicians who, especially Republican right-wing politicians who have opposed government intervention in this, many of them had caught COVID themselves, like Trump did, and then said, it's just no big deal, you know. And in a way, the reality was their own personal reality outweighed the premediation of other kinds of impacts. And so in a sense, I think that does reinforce what you're saying, is that sometimes for some people, or at least for people who are skeptical, it can be a combination of sort of news media and their own experience that makes them resist what they see on media. But this is a problem right now, I think, a whole different problem from when I first wrote the premediation book, which is this problem of fake news, and this problem in which people just literally do not share the same universe. Exactly. And the reason they don't share the same universe or pluriverse, as William James might suggest, is through the mediation that they consume and are interacting with over and over.
Thank you. We have a question from Marta Ninjas. Please, Marta, come forward.
Hey, Marta.
Actually, is not Marta. Is Mauro. I'm sorry, I'm disguised as Marta. Good afternoon, everybody.
Sorry, Mauro.
No, don't worry. It's my problem with the sharing the same laptop with Marta. I don't know if I can show my face.
Can you please enable the video of Mauro?
Yes, okay.
Maybe you could show Marta's face instead, Mauro.
No, okay, now we see you, Mauro.
So my question is linked to Vittorio's one, and at the same time is linked to the event of September 11th and your reflection, Richard, about September 11th. Actually, we experienced the two very different experiences from the aspect of our temporal experience. September 11th, all the people all over the world watched the same event at the same time. Here, we share an event gradually enlarging all over the world. I was wondering whether we could say that the lack of effectiveness of premediation of the pandemic event in our lived experience is due to the fact that, as you stressed, we were maybe prepared to premediate a global media event, but we were not prepared to premediate a global mediation event. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I think the temporality is exactly right. I mean, as I suggested that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic is not have the immediacy. I use that one example, just I found these two photographs, does not have the immediacy that 9/11 had. I mean, the thing that made 9/11 so powerful, and one of the things I start with in thinking about premediation, is that it really was perhaps the last truly global media event where, or sort of the global remediation event, because 9/11 was exemplary of the double logic of mediation, where on the one hand, you had the televisual immediacy of the towers on fire and collapsing, that you just created this incredible sense of shock, fear, surprise, whatever, variety of emotions and affects. And then you had its hypermediation on screen, but also across all of these networks. And you're absolutely right. The pandemic doesn't have that immediacy moment. There are examples I was trying to find, I probably can if I look hard enough, image photographs of, let's say, people lining up for vaccines or people lining up in food lines, because I remember seeing those kinds of things in the US. And those are powerful images too, but nothing like the...
in Italy was coffins on trucks, on army trucks.
Yeah, okay. And the coffins, I think, right, were also a super powerful image as well. But because the pandemic, I mean, and this is where temporality is so crucial. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that events like the pandemic and like other kinds of sort of 21st century crises that combine human action with non-human events like climate change or the effects of hurricanes and things like that, and contagious diseases, all of these things are so distributed across time that the way to deal with them, I mean, it becomes, impossible to deal with them in, as I said, my example was putting out a fire, or cleaning up a mess. If somebody spills something in your kitchen, you just clean up the mess. You've been spilling something in a lake or in a river, a company for years, you can't just clean that up. That process is one that is absolutely sort of distributed in its nature. And so the only way you can try to deal with it is through premediating its impact, because it doesn't have the immediacy of something like 9/11. But I think you're both absolutely right that premediation is in no ways as powerful in mobilizing people in respect to these kinds of distributed catastrophes than they are in response to immediate catastrophes. But now let me just qualify that, or at least maybe add another piece to that. In the US, on January 6th, we had an event that was about as close to a 9/11 event as this country has had. And that is that insurrection or assault on the US Capitol. That is, while people were watching live Congress voting to accept the results of the presidential election, at that very moment, we had coverage of, and because it began to build so dramatically, of these, whatever you want to call them, let's say insurrectionists, invading the Capitol, smashing doors, smashing buildings, killing police, going after senators and congressmen. This was very powerful for people. And it was so powerful that if you see what politicians, right-wing politicians in the United States said that day or the day after, they were clearly impacted, in shock by that, much as people were impacted by 9/11. But the problem today, and this is to come back to the answer I was giving to Vittorio, and I guess maybe I need to spend some more time working on this. I've really been reluctant to think about this whole notion of fake news, or, you know, this questions about fake truths and so forth, because they imply to me, you know, as if real news is absolutely true. I mean, in some sense, all news is, it's made, to use, you know, Latour's sense, it's constructed in a sense. New facts are factish, you know, they're made like fictions, as he talks about. But still, what that making of fake news and of non-fake news, if we want to accept that idea, what that does is make it difficult for people to hold on to their embodied experience. And this is where, you know, something like data mediation or some form of distributed kind of mediation comes into play, where people, so Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and these other politicians who were like, this is horrible, this must stop, the president should have stopped it, etc. 3 days later, after being exposed to all of the Fox News and right-wing news, they changed their tune. It's like their own experience vanished, and they came back into the same kind of mindset. So we really are faced here. I mean, I'm more interested in if I want to think further about fake news, I'd like to think about Jean-Francois Lyotard's concept of the différend, where he talks about how sometimes you have two people or two parties who are engaged in debate or disagreement or argument who can't even communicate with each other, can't even make contact, because their assumptions, the worlds in which they live, are so different. So to come back to the question, I think that the reason that premediation was both ineffective in, you know, or less effective than it was after 9/11 in response to 9/11. I mean, it wasn't before 9/11, of course, but after, was less effective because of the, I think, as people have been saying, the lack of proximity. Although what made it effective, whatever effectiveness it does have, comes from what I would argue is the proximity of our screens to us and of our screen experience. And it's that proximity that gives it some force. And I guess I would also say finally that the effectiveness, I guess I still want to hold on to the fact that there was some effectiveness, both collectively, because imagine if we hadn't quarantined based on premediations of the future. Imagine if we had just done what some governors in Texas or Florida or others said and just opened everything up. It's just the flu. You know, I think those curves would not be flattened the way they have been. And even though they have not been perfectly flattened, I think the difference is not insignificant. So yeah, I both accept the critique, but also would push back a little bit and suggest that whatever effectiveness that has resulted in trying to stem this pandemic has been, to a great extent, the result of the various premediations of what might happen. Also, I know that on an individual level, especially among academic social media, like my academic Facebook, I mean, I've seen people 6 months into the quarantine said, this is the first time I've left my house in 6 months. Now, to me, that's an overreaction from my perspective to the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic. I, from the beginning, went out on walks regularly. And yet there are people who didn't, you know. I shopped carefully. I picked my hours to go to the grocery store. I didn't go when it was crowded. I wore masks. I tried to not get too close to people, but there were ways to do this. But the premediation of the dangers of this disease, I think, caused many, many, many people to change their behavior, even while there's this whole other group that wasn't affected at all.
Thank you. We have a written question from Alan Ralph. In what ways is your perceptive analysis, thank you, a paradigm always destined to repeat itself like a virus? That is, that remediation militates against experience, which isn't yet widespread? Narratives like those of Defoe, Saramago, and Marquez may well capture this paradigm. I hope I read it correctly, but if you want, you can speak for yourself.
Alan is capable of speaking for himself. That's certainly true. Well, since he's not speaking, I will. Yeah, one of the things that I think I left out of here, and that I think if I develop this further, I would add in, are the kind of narratives of the plague and other kinds of pandemics that can be seen as forms of premediation of the contemporary pandemic, but others which sort of remediate past experiences. So I think that you're right. There is a kind of repetition that happens here in how we respond to it. I don't know about whether it's destined to repeat itself, but I think that that does happen. And so I taught a course on pandemic literature in the fall and started with Camus' The Plague, and then ended with a near future oriented account of a pandemic, in a almost global pandemic, but from a US perspective. And I think that narratives do, certainly they impact our response to pandemics. And I think that there is a kind of generic format that these narratives often follow. So, yeah.
Sorry, Richard, I'm trying to get my image to show, but it won't do it. So,
that's okay. Your voice is good enough.
Can you please turn on the camera of Alan Ralph?
Yes, I'm doing that.
Okay, all right, I got it. It's okay. Not that you want to see me. So yeah, and just to follow up on what you're saying, because this is a wonderful talk, Richard, and is also thinking about the difference between the mediation, the kind of premediation in terms of either point-specific events, to some extent like 9/11, versus process-driven events like what we're experiencing in COVID. And in, let's say, the paradigm of the plague versus the paradigm of the tragedy.
Yeah, I think that, I think that distinction makes a lot of sense. And I haven't really thought about that kind of contrast, but I think you could see, so are you suggesting that 9/11 was a tragedy as opposed to a plague? And a tragedy, in a sense, brought on by the fatal flaw of U.S. policy and things like that. So that might actually work kind of nicely. But I think, I do think that a version of, I think, what both Vittorio and Mauro were suggesting, that the way in which mediation responds to and generates point-specific events is kind of different from the way in which it works in something more distributed, temporally distributed like the plague. And I think that the thing about 9/11 is that it itself was not premediated very much, although there films that had, there were some premediations of it. But what it did in being such a powerful remediation of this event and so compelling globally and mediologically, that it then triggered or generated this sort of proliferation of premediations of other terror events, of other kinds of fears and so forth. And so there is, again, these things for me are always kinds of, there's a watershed moment, but it's not a complete turn. It's more a kind of, wave or movement. And I do think, as I argued in premediation, that 9/11 did sort of signal, it didn't do it itself, but signal a shift from remediation as a predominant logic in making sense of, certainly of our digital world, to premediation, which is much more involved with technologies of modeling, simulation, speculation, and so forth. And I think that shift is real. And I think premediation does then pertain to and have more relevance to the COVID-19 pandemic than remediation did. So maybe we've moved from tragedy to plague or to carnival or something like that.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah,
I think we have now a question from Francesco Casetti. Please turn on his mic and camera.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful, a lot of questions. But I go straight to an ontological question. It's extremely clear that there is no distinction between the virus and its mediation. That's clear. Things become to be what they are through mediation. That is the ending of your radical mediation, which means the ending of your text, there is a relational nature of things and events. I was very, very interested in the passage from experience to data and the parallel you made. Are you ready to think that the very nature of things and events is ultimately informational?
I don't like information as a term. So, I mean, I am ready to think that it's transformational in that sense, that the relation between things and events is, because for me, the force of mediation is both to argue against a kind of notion of representation, so that partly that's in there. And, I can't remember if I had a chance to ask Vittorio this in his talk, but one of the things that I was interested in back in the first lecture in the symposium was how Vittorio described the sort of mirror neurons and the effect that we have, or the mirror neurons as representing what is perceived. And I wanted to say they're not representing, but mediating, because I think that representation imagines a kind of ontological gap, imagines two kinds of things, as opposed to mediation, which imagines really simultaneously one kind of thing, or more really a multiplicity of things that mediation involves. There are just many of them, but that there's not this kind of separation. So that's why I wouldn't want to use information. Latour has a very brilliant short little essay called "There is no information, only transformation." And I take that to heart, that information often as well imagines a separation between the information and what it is made up of, or in the world. And so yeah, with a small friendly amendment, I would accept your question.
Thank you. Other questions?
Francesco Parisi, Cisco, has a question.
All right, right. Please, Cisco.
Yes. First of all, hi, Richard. Hi, Vittorio.
Hi.
It's been nice seeing you and attending to your talk that I found very convincing. In fact, I'm not sure, Vittorio, that proximity is always necessary for prompting, fear and overreaction. In fact, in the first phase of the pandemic, I witnessed in South Italy people literally losing their minds without any actual presence of the virus in the territory, but just by watching news. So it's been impressive to me to notice, to realize how massive can be the effect of remediation in that case, but also combined to premediation. If you don't do this, then you will, And so this, because of this, I have a first question for you, Richard. Do you think that premediation can be controlled? Can we react? Can we have a way to react to premediation effects? Is there any vaccine for premediation? And its tremendous effects on society and economics, etc. And the second question comes from the unexpected and interesting parallelism between the virus, the mediation on the virus, and the mediation of media, and because it gives me the opportunity to bring the parallelism to another level, and to the information and communication technology parallelism between the virus, and in the virus in computers, and like an agent of invisible distributed agency. The virus acts in some invisible ways. What kind of role, in your opinion, did artificial intelligence play in this scenario, if any? In bubbling Facebook, in shaping reality, in choosing, in targeting users instead of others. So what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't really thought much about it, so it's a good question. And before I answer, to give myself some time to think about it, I want to come back when you were talking about the, again, sort of reiterating the parallel between viral mediation and, let's say, mediation of our print, television, and social media. The virus works by, the way it's described to work is by copying the information in the RNA onto, after the mediation occurs, then the RNA gets copied and then spreads throughout the body. And I guess I would, if I want to develop this further, think and look a little bit into this question of information. And this is now to just circle back to Francesco Cassetti's question. And perhaps information too is not the best way to think about it. In fact, perhaps one of the consequences of this argument I'm making for virologists could be for them to see that the relationship itself is not a copying of information, but it's actually a mediation, because it involves the transformation. I mean, whenever the information is copied, it's not just this immaterial information at all. It's something very material in a strand of, small strand of RNA and so forth. So anyway, thanks for that. That helps me at least think more about that. In terms of, by artificial intelligence, you mean like the algorithms that are employed by social media to show us certain kinds of things. Yeah, I think that they do intensify the fear as people respond, right? They're based largely on a number of responses, for example, to different posts. And so as people are afraid and people repost and comment and share, that starts to push those posts up to in your news feed, and that only intensifies the fear as well. So I think that's a really good point that I have not given much thought to in regard to this paper. But I think you're spot on that there is a kind of algorithmic mediation that also helps to make the fear more contagious. And in making the fear more contagious, it actually may help reduce the contagiousness of the virus. So, I mean, it could actually have, I mean, of that, but it then increases the contagiousness of the affective consequences of fear. One of the things I didn't talk about much in this paper, but that I've been thinking a lot about, actually, in thinking about fear and Trump, which I've sort of put on the back burner now, thankfully, is, you know, I've talked a bit about how in a couple of things I've published, talked about Trump's tweets as forms of terrorism, because in producing fear in people, they are actually creating violent or negative consequences, because fear elevates your blood pressure, it reduces the immune system response, and has other kinds of physiological effects. And so part of the reason, another sort of argument for the interconnectivity of mediation and embodied experience in the way I've been describing it here, has to do with the fact that affect and emotion also produce bodily responses, and often destructive or debilitating responses. So yeah, I think it's not a great answer to your question, except to say, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that kind of algorithmic intelligence, or, you know, the artificial intelligence of these algorithms does certainly help to make the fear more communicable and more widespread. And then what that does, you know, it has negative consequences, depression. I mean, you know, one of the things of quarantine and everything else, and I think the fears that go with it, are increased rates of suicide we've seen, increased depression, especially among young people, and so forth. So yeah, it's all kind of connected in that way. So did I get at what you were asking?
Yeah. About the vaccine on premediation, is
Yes.
there any vaccine for premediation, or just have to accept it as a matter of fact, is an unavoidable matter of fact in the...
So I don't know if we necessarily, I'm not sure. Yeah, the one question is, do we want a vaccine against premediation? I'm not certain about that. If premediation produces negative consequences, I think we do. If premediation produces positive consequences, then I think we don't. But the interesting thing about how I think fear works and affect works is that often we have the affective bodily response before we have the cognitive response that makes sense of it. And I think that the vaccine, it's hard to vaccinate against that affective response, it seems to me. The vaccination could happen through more like treatment, that once you have the disease of fear, then we need to find ways to treat it or something like that. But yeah, that's to take that metaphor further. But I do really, last thing, appreciate your response to Vittorio, and in a way to Mauro as well, about proximity not being necessary. And I would just add that, and I sort of said this earlier as a side comment, that that premediation does involve proximity, but it's a proximity with our screens and our devices. And it's precisely because they are so close to us and that we do have such an intimate relationship with them that they do have these powerful effects on our mood, emotion, actions, and so forth. So,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Albert Figurt. Which media do you think will be used, or it's already in use, to transform the struggle of quarantine into audiovisual storytelling, since we are mostly sitting, working, learning, attending conferences in front of a screen?
That's an interesting question. I'm not really much on predicting, but I think that I think media are, as you say, already in use. in terms of audiovisual storytelling. The way in which, for one thing, our social media now loves the idea of stories, right? So Facebook, which used to only have a timeline or a news feed, now has a story. Same thing with Insta and other media. So I think it is already in place. My sense is that currently, the media that we see are much more these kind of distributed social media networks rather than media meant to be consumed in audiovisual media meant to be consumed in one sitting. But I imagine that Hollywood already has, big screen movies in the works on the pandemic, and there are beginning to come out some, TV series, Netflix and HBO and others about the impacts, stories about the impacts of pandemics. So I don't think, personally, I find that those are less effective because they have a harder time capturing the interrelationship of non-human and human consequences. I think the Hollywood narratives, cinematic or televisual, tend to be so human-centered in their narratives. And I think that to really think about this quarantine struggle, I mean, I'm not maybe sure exactly what you mean by the struggle of quarantine per se, but to communicate or, the pandemic or to tell narratives of pandemic, I would like to see, I think the most effective narratives would be one that engage some of the non-human elements. Having said that, I mean, there is this 2011, I think, movie, Contagion, which I also taught in my course last fall. And that does a halfway decent job of incorporating some of the scientific aspects of its imaginary disease into cinema. But I really think that other forms of media probably are more effective than video or cinema in telling these stories. But yeah, it's a good question, but I'm not really sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? May I ask you something while we wait, if there are some other question being asked? Did you notice any difference between the mediation performed by TV channels and radio? I had the impression in Italy that the radio was closer with its mediation than many television channels. I might be biased by the fact that I discover myself listening to the radio more and more during the quarantine than I used to do beforehand. So my intake of radio increased, and this probably might well bias my experience. But I'm curious to learn about your experience when it comes to radio.
I rarely listen to the radio.
Okay.
So I can't say that, but I think if you find that the case, I mean, I guess what I would suggest is, that perhaps McLuhan's distinction between radio and television, radio as a hot medium and television as a cool medium, might in fact have something to say here, in that radio in capturing a single sense provides a real kind of focused intensity that might provide a kind of proximity. And that has to do, right, with the ear versus the eye, and the way in which when we see things, we tend to see them as being out there. As I look at you, you know, you are distant from me, you are separate in a certain sense. There's my eyes and there's you, but when I hear you inside me. And so I think in terms of the directness, I think that has a lot to do with, you know, the sense ratios of media. But yeah, I don't have an experience of that myself.
Good point. Thank you. I don't see any other questions.
Does that mean it's cocktail hour?
I wish we could all now convene into a nice bar and have whatever we feel like.
Someday.
This hour. It would be probably a Bloody Mary for me.
Yeah.
This time of the day. Okay. If there are no further questions, I will really wish to thank very much Richard for offering us this very stimulating and exciting talk, and I think it will continue to foster questions and thought also in the coming days. Thank you, Richard. It was really great having you, and we will reconvene for our next webinar. The next speaker will be Mark Hansen. So have a great weekend and see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Vittorio. Bye, all. Thank you all.
Bye. Bye, everyone.